recording will work, because obviously the people dramatising the reading will be more spread out than normal, but at least we're trying. But first I want to do a little bit of background to the story that we will be hearing from the book of Ruth. To begin with, the historical context. Ruth is set in the period of the Judges. So that's a period in the Old Testament between Joshua, who was kind of the leader who took the people into the promised land after Moses died, and King Saul, who was the first proper king of Israel. So roughly 1350 to 1050 BC. We can't be precise because we don't know exactly the exact years of the Judges, and we also don't know the exact years of the book of Ruth, because it doesn't specify which judge was in charge. And the family tree that is given at the very end of the book is very short and suggests that there may be names that have simply been left out. They kind of give a shorter one. So we don't know exactly, but it happens during the period of the Judges. It was written a lot later because it ends, as you will find out, with the genealogy of King David. So it was obviously written after David had become king. Somebody suggests it might have been written during the reign of King Solomon, kind of looking back at how the dynasty of David came to, well, not came to be, but its humble beginnings, if you like. Because it starts with a very ordinary family from Bethlehem in Judea. And Bethlehem was a very ordinary village. At this point in time, there was nothing special about it. And the book of Ruth is part of the explanation why Bethlehem became significant and why it is that now, if I say Bethlehem, you will recognize that name of a very obscure little village in Judea. Ruth is part of the reason why we all know the name Bethlehem. The book starts with a famine, which wasn't unusual, especially in the period of the Judges, where God punished the people in various ways for various shortcomings. And we have this family, Elimelech and Naomi and the two sons, who leave Bethlehem and travel east of Israel to Moab, which they shouldn't have done. They should not have left their ancestral land. God had kind of said that. Don't go back to where you were before. Stay with your land and seek the Lord for his blessing. But we do know from the very end of the book of Judges, which is the very last verse that comes before the book of Ruth, that in those days Israel had no king and everyone did as they saw fit. Which is basically what Elimelech is doing. He says, I can't stay here, so he leaves, endangering his inheritance. And not only that, but his two sons marry Moabite women. Now, that wasn't strictly speaking completely forbidden in the law, but it was definitely not ideal, because foreign women worship foreign gods. And foreign gods, of course, were a great threat to Israel. So the general ethos, if you like, of the law and of Israelite community was don't marry non-Israelite women, because they might bring their gods in to pollute our worship in Israel. So they should not have married these Moabite women. Although in this story, you'll find that fear of foreign women bringing foreign gods into Israel is sort of turned on its head in this particular story. Because Elimelech seems to be a typical judge period Israelite. He can't be particularly pious. We don't read anything about but he kind of feared the Lord. He wouldn't have left Israel and married his sons off the Moabite women if he was. He's actually fairly insignificant. He doesn't even get a speaking role, and he dies in verse 3. So he's very insignificant. And then his two sons, who had married these Moabite women, also die. So Naomi, the widow, then decides to return back home to Bethlehem. She's been away for about 10 years, and she decides to return home. So now let's have the first 2 chapters of this story.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they'd lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her daughters-in-law,
"Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband."
Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her,
"We will go back with you to your people."
"Oh no, my daughters, return home. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me."
At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her.
"Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her."
"Oh, please don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me."
When Naomi realised that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed,
Everybody?
Can this be Naomi?
"Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me."
So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi,
"Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour."
"Go ahead, my daughter."
So she went out, entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters.
"The Lord be with you."
The
Lord bless you.
Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters,
"Who does that young woman belong to?"
She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field in the morning and she's remained here until now, except for a short rest in the shelter.
"My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled."
At this she bowed down with her face to the ground and asked him,
why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?
I've been told all about you and what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people who did not know you before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.
May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my lord. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls.
At mealtime, Boaz said to her,
Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar.
When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men.
Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull some stalks out for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So
Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she'd gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave to her what she'd left over after she'd eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her,
Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Oh, blessed be the man who took notice of you.
The name of the man in whose fields I work today is Boaz.
The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers.
He even said to me, Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.
It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed.
So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
So now we've met the three main characters. The first one, Naomi. Her name means pleasant, and she doesn't like that, so she wants to be called Mara, bitter. And she does seem to be quite bitter. She's lost both her husband and her sons, which means in that context she has no further hope for the future. All that she can look forward to is hardship and poverty. And yes, she has Ruth, and yes, Ruth chooses to stay with her, but that can't, in that culture, really make up for having lost her husband and sons. And she blames God for her misfortunes, and basically says that God is against me. Which is kind of ironic, because she doesn't know what God has in store for her yet. And I guess from Naomi, we can learn that it is okay to complain to God. And I've said that before. There are lots of psalms you can use to complain to God as well. If you just feel everything is against you, tell God about it. But we could also kind of look at how she's dealing with it. If we assume that God is involved in the good stuff that happens in our lives, shouldn't we allow that he might also be involved in some of the bad stuff as well? Especially when we realize that we don't actually know where that bad stuff might lead. She had no idea what was coming. So she complained, it was fine. And she can teach us to assume that God is involved. She just hadn't quite got the big picture yet. And then of course then we have Ruth, the Moabite, who is the good example, the role model, who is very committed to Naomi, which is quite impressive. The Bible doesn't make it clear exactly why, if she just had a very strong feeling of family loyalty, if she really liked Naomi as a person, or if it had to do with the God of Israel. Because you have to remember, she's a foreigner, she's a Moabite, not an Israelite. This is significant, because she was born outside of the covenant. The Moabites, they weren't arch enemies of the Israelites, but they weren't really on friendly terms most of the time, and they worshipped idols, as did all the nations around Israel back then. So she had a completely different background. Until she married one of Naomi's sons, she wouldn't really have known much about the God of Israel. Some hearsay maybe, we can't be certain, but she wouldn't have had any personal experience of worshipping the true God. The Bible also doesn't spell out if this was a full-fledged, genuine conversion, as in, I now realize that Yahweh is the only true God. If her in-laws weren't particularly pious, it's kind of difficult to see how she would have come to that conclusion, but she's obviously seen something, she's obviously understood something, she believes something. As I said last week, you don't necessarily have to understand everything in order to make a faith commitment to God. And in this case, I don't think Ruth had quite understood everything about the God of Israel, but she must have understood something, and she makes this faith commitment, loyalty commitment, and in the Old Testament, well, in both languages in the Bible, faithfulness are actually the same root. If you have faith, you will be faithful. So she makes this faith/faithfulness commitment to Naomi. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. A very powerful statement. And we, again, may not quite realize just what a sacrifice this is. Because she was married to this man, he died before they had children. She's now leaving with her mother-in-law to go back to a country that she's never seen, doesn't know anything about. She may not have children. She's taking that risk, if you like. At this point, it seems quite likely that she will remain a widow for the rest of her life. So she's accepting this fate of remaining childless for the rest of her life, which was a big sacrifice. And of course, she's leaving her home country, her hometown, her parents. And back then, they didn't have Ryanair and EasyJet and things like that. You could kind of jet across the seas easily. They only had the River Jordan between them, but she was quite likely not to be able to go back and visit the family again, at least not on a very regular basis. So there's quite a sacrifice involved in what Ruth is doing here, which is a good reminder that sometimes obeying God does involve big sacrifices. And it seems like in this case, Ruth, the foreigner, understands that better than Naomi, the Israelite. And then she goes on to learn something more about Israel's God, and that is that God cares about the poor, and He cares about the people. She goes out to glean, collect fallen stalks and ears of corn, barley, whatever, in the fields of people. That was required by law. That was her legal right to go and glean at the edges of fields. The law of Moses spells that out. Landowners have to leave these stalks for the poor to glean. So God is kind of already there looking after the poor in general, but then, by God's providence, and make no mistake, it doesn't spell it out, but it so happens that she started gleaning in the fields of her older relative, Boaz. That is God's providential work behind the scenes. I say older, we don't know how much older he is, but he's obviously a landowner in his own right. He has many servants, so he's fairly rich. And in chapter 3, he suggests that he is no longer a young man, but unless he's widowed, he's probably not terribly old, seeing as he hasn't got married to anybody else yet, so we don't know. But he's clearly not the same age as Ruth, who's still a young woman. But we do know that he's a godly man, and he's a very kind and compassionate man, and those two things should go together. If you're godly, you should be kind and compassionate. You can't really be one without the other. And we see that in this story because he tells his workers to leave more than the legal minimum required for Ruth to glean. He tells Ruth, don't go anywhere else, I'll make sure my workers don't harass you, which of course was another danger for a young woman. He invites her to come and eat with his workers. He goes well over and beyond the call of duty in this case. So he is clearly a godly man. And he's also, as Naomi points out, a kinsman redeemer. Or the NIV 2011 calls him a guardian redeemer, which in a way explains more what his role was, but it misses out on the fact that it is a blood relative that is involved. In a world without benefits, no social security of any sort, the family was the only safety net, and the kinsman redeemer is the nearest relative who has a legal obligation to protect and provide for struggling relatives. It's a very important concept in the Old Testament law. If you had to sell your property, for whatever reason, the kinsman redeemer is supposed to buy back for you. If you had to sell yourself into slavery, again, the kinsman redeemer is obliged to buy you back. And if you're killed, well, the kinsman redeemer is the one who has to revenge your death. And buying back, in more biblical language, is redeem. If you've ever come across a word in the Bible, to redeem, it just means to buy back. And it goes back partly to this concept of the kinsman redeemer, who has to basically help you pay your debt. Or if you're the rich one, you pay somebody else's debt in your family. It's a very important concept in the Bible when we talk about redemption. And we'll return to that in the third part, but for now, before we hear the second part of the story, let's all stand and sing together. Sing "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah," because we do see in this story how God is guiding the main characters, and we'll find out what that is as well. So let's stand and sing.
Oh,
Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her,
"My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do."
I will do whatever you say.
So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned and there was a woman lying at his feet.
Who are you?
I'm your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer of our family.
The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after younger men, whether rich or poor, and now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am the kinsman redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your kinsman redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning.
So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before it was light enough for anyone to be recognised.
No one must know the woman came to the threshing floor. Bring me your shawl that you are wearing and hold it out.
When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then she went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked,
"How did it go, my daughter?"
Then Ruth told her everything Boaz had done for her, adding,
He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, "Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed."
"Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today."
Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there, just as the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along.
Come over here, my friend, and sit down.
So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said,
Please, sit here.
They did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer,
Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring this matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of all these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, but I am the next in line.
Yes, I will redeem it.
But on the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property.
Well, in that case, I can't redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I can't do it.
Now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz,
Buy it yourself.
and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people,
Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilian and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses.
Then the elders and all the people at the gate said,
We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Herod in time of war to Judah.
So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi,
Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth.
Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said,
Naomi has a son.
and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David.
So there we have it, the whole story of Ruth. And sometimes we get a bit hung up on the cultural differences here. Obviously business transactions were different back then. We don't normally involve sandals, for example. And this whole concept that if a man dies without children, his nearest relative marries a widow, and the first child that is born will be counted as a child of the dead man. Obviously we do not apply that anymore, but it was important back then to keep the family going, to keep the land in the family. And of course the incident at the threshing floor might sound slightly suggestive to us, a bit on the naughty side, but there isn't actually any indication in the Hebrew text that anything untoward happened. It's just an ingenious way for Ruth as a woman to basically propose to Boaz. And he gets the message, as you can tell. We wouldn't do it that way nowadays, but there we are. The main point is, what did God do through all of this? What do we learn from this story? Well, for one thing, we learn that God is at work behind the scenes. I've already pointed that out. He guided Ruth to the field of Boaz. And of course, by ending the whole story with the family tree of King David, there is a suggestion that, unlike the situation at the end of Judges, just before this book, God is going to give Israel a good king, which was King David. So God is at work behind the scenes, and God uses ordinary people when he works out his plans. Ruth and Boaz, they're nothing special. They were perfectly ordinary people. But they were loyal to the God of Israel, which in Ruth's case, of course, is particularly extraordinary. But Boaz, even though he lived in the era of the Judges, was clearly also a committed follower of Yahweh. So they're loyal to Israel's God, and they decide to do the right thing. And by doing that, they become ancestors of Israel's most famous king, and by doing that, they become ancestors of Jesus. Because in Matthew 1, both Boaz and Ruth are mentioned in the family tree of Jesus. And it's quite ironic in a way, because according to Deuteronomy, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. And if that applied to that, literally, King David would have been disqualified from being part of the worshipping congregation in Jerusalem. Which shows us that, even though that sounds harsh, it was never intended to be exclusive. It was meant to exclude idolaters, the people who worship foreign gods. And in this case, Ruth accepted the God of Israel and basically became an Israelite, if you like. And it also hints at that later inclusion of all nations in the salvation that was brought about by King David's greatest son, Jesus. Because Ruth and Boaz are also an illustration of God's plan of salvation. Ruth, she's us. We're all like Ruth, born outside the covenant, but we have to choose to follow the God of Israel, as he has now revealed himself to us in Jesus. And we get a new people, the people of God, which is worldwide and through all the ages. We become part of the people of God. We commit ourselves to new allegiance, which might seem scary, might seem like a sacrifice, but turns out to be worth it. And Boaz, of course, represents Jesus, our kinsman redeemer, who made a greater sacrifice than Boaz because he became human so that he could be our kinsman. So he could be part of the human race and redeem us. We lost our eternal home through sin and rebellion, and Jesus buys it back for us. We lost our freedom. We were sold to slavery to sin, and Jesus buys us back, sets us free. And we've even been killed. We've lost our lives because the consequence of sin is death. And Jesus confronts death full on and becomes death of death and hell's destruction. It's a great phrase, and that's him that was saying, death of death. So Jesus, as a kinsman redeemer, deals with us having lost our property, us having sold ourselves into slavery, and having been killed by sin. So Jesus is the great kinsman redeemer. And this love story, for that is part obviously what it is, illustrates as well that God's redemption, that Jesus did all this, flows out of his love for us. Boaz is acting partly out of obligation, but also out of love. There was somebody else who had priority, who could have done the same thing, and who chose not to go ahead because it would endanger his own family and his family inheritance. Boaz chooses to take that risk because of his love, his loyalty, his faith. Remember, may remember that I mentioned the word chesed, which is a common word in the Old Testament for God's love, mercy, sacrificial love, loving kindness. It features in this story as well. When you heard the word kindness, that is actually the same word, chesed, which is used about God's mercy and loving kindness. And the people in this story demonstrate that because their devotion and love for each other goes beyond physical attraction and emotional attachment. It's a loyalty, it's devotion, it's mercy. And we're meant to see God's even stronger mercy and love behind all of it. God provides a home for faithful Ruth. He provides a devoted wife for Boaz. And even bitter Naomi is blessed with descendants. Just as in the bigger picture where Jesus provides an eternal home for his people. We are the children of God. We are a family. And we're also described as the bride of Christ. It's all in there. It's illustrating this eternal loving relationship that we as the people of God have with our Saviour. Salvation through God's redeeming love is written all across this story. And it reminds us of something that Naomi had to learn, that God isn't against us. God is for us and with us. And he can turn the most despairing situation into something good for his purposes and his plans. And it's worth bearing that in mind. The story hasn't finished yet. We're not quite there yet. But God is working it out. And in the end, that will be blessing.